Rock and roll lost its innocence in a frozen Iowa cornfield. Soul music sank to the bottom of a Wisconsin lake. And Southern rock crashed into a Mississippi swamp 3 days after releasing an album cover that showed the band surrounded by flames. In a rush to keep the music playing, legends entrusted their lives to tired pilots and fragile planes. Tragically, some of the 20th century's greatest voices were silenced not by time, but by the cruelty of a sudden fall. Subscribe to Terra Obscura and stay with us. The bus had broken down again. The heater had quit 2 days earlier, and the performers huddled in the back were freezing. One musician had already been hospitalized with frostbite. 2 more were running fevers. The Winter Dance Party tour was only 11 days old, and the artists traveling across the upper Midwest in January and February of 1959 had already given it a name. They called it the Tour from Hell. The route was brutal. 24 cities in 24 days, across Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, on freezing roads and in a bus with no heat. By the time the tour reached Clear Lake, Iowa on the evening of February 2nd, Buddy Holly had had enough. After the show at the Surf Ballroom, Holly arranged a charter flight to Fargo, North Dakota, near the next venue in Moorhead, Minnesota. The idea was simple: fly ahead, sleep in a real bed, do laundry, and avoid another night on the freezing bus. There were 3 passenger seats on the plane. Holly took one. J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper, was sick with a fever and asked Holly's bass player, Waylon Jennings, for his seat. Jennings agreed. The 3rd seat went to Ritchie Valens, who won it from guitarist Tommy Allsup on a coin toss. The flight was arranged through Dwyer Flying Service at Mason City Municipal Airport, about 20 miles from Clear Lake. The aircraft was a 1947 Beechcraft Bonanza, a small single-engine airplane with room for 4. The pilot was Roger Peterson, 21 years old, a commercial pilot and flight instructor. But Peterson had a serious problem. He was not certified to fly on instruments. He had failed his instrument check months earlier and was restricted to visual flight rules, meaning he was only qualified to fly when he could see the ground and the horizon. He was not supposed to fly in clouds, snow, or poor visibility at night. The weather that night was exactly the kind he should have avoided. Snow was falling at Mason City. Conditions along the route were worse, with stronger winds, icing, and deteriorating visibility. Peterson received weather briefings, but critical warnings about worsening conditions were not fully passed on to him. He had also been working for about 17 hours by the time of the flight. There was another detail that would later matter. The Bonanza was equipped with a Sperry attitude gyro, an instrument that showed aircraft attitude differently from the type Peterson had trained on. Both instruments gave the same information, but their displays moved in opposite ways. A pilot under stress at night in bad weather could misread it. The Bonanza took off from Mason City just before 1 in the morning on February 3, 1959. The owner of the flying service watched it climb, turn northwest toward Fargo, and continue into the dark. Then, only a few miles from the airport, he saw the aircraft's tail light begin to descend. It kept descending until it disappeared. He tried to contact Peterson by radio. There was no answer. He tried again and again through the night. At daybreak, he took off in another aircraft and searched the route. About 6 miles northwest of the airport in a frozen cornfield, he found the wreckage. The Bonanza had struck the ground at high speed, banked sharply right and nose down. It tore apart on impact. Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, J.P. Richardson, and Roger Peterson were all killed instantly. The Civil Aeronautics Board concluded that Peterson had entered instrument conditions shortly after takeoff and become spatially disoriented. Investigators believed he likely misread the attitude gyro, thinking the aircraft was climbing when it was actually descending. 5 minutes after takeoff, he flew the Bonanza into the ground without realizing he was in a dive. Buddy Holly was 22. Ritchie Valens was 17. J.P. Richardson was 28. Roger Peterson was 21. The tragedy would later become known by the name that Don McLean gave it in American Pie, The Day the Music Died. What makes the story so haunting is how ordinary the decision seemed at first. It was not supposed to be a reckless journey. It was supposed to be a short flight to escape a miserable bus ride, get some sleep, and make the next show on time. The fare was $36 a seat. The destination was still hundreds of miles away, but the flight never made it past the first few minutes. They were not lost over mountains or oceans. They were not far from home. They were only 6 miles from the airport when the airplane went down. A freezing tour bus, a tired pilot, worsening weather, and a flight that never should have left the ground turned a practical decision into one of the most famous crashes in American cultural history. Country music lost one of its greatest voices in the woods of Tennessee. The cause was hauntingly similar. A pilot without an instrument rating flew into weather he could not handle, lost sight of the ground, and drove a small airplane into the earth at full speed. Patsy Cline was 30 years old. and at the peak of her career. After years of hardship and struggle in Nashville, she had broken through with songs like Crazy and I Fall to Pieces and had become one of the most important women in country music. By early 1963, she was no longer just a country singer. She was a national star. On March 3, 1963, Cline performed at a benefit concert in Kansas City for the family of a local disc jockey who had recently died in a car accident. Also on the show were Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins, both established Grand Ole Opry performers. Bad weather delayed the group's departure by a full day. Another performer, Dottie West, offered to drive Cline home to Nashville. Cline declined. On the afternoon of March 5th, Cline, Copas, and Hawkins boarded a Piper Comanche at Fairfax Municipal Airport in Kansas City. The pilot was Randy Hughes, 34 years old, Cline's manager and Copas' son-in-law. Hughes held a private pilot certificate, but he was not instrument rated. He was an inexperienced pilot, flying a single-engine aircraft hundreds of miles across rough terrain and worsening weather. The flight did not go smoothly. Weather forced multiple stops. The aircraft landed first in Arkansas to refuel. Later, as conditions worsened, Hughes landed again at Dyersburg Regional Airport in western Tennessee and asked for a weather briefing for the final leg to Nashville. The briefing was not good. The FAA employee on duty told Hughes that local conditions were marginal for visual flight and that the weather at Nashville was below VFR minimums. Nearby ceilings had dropped to about 500 feet. For a pilot without instrument training, the message was clear: stay on the ground. Hughes asked whether the runway lights at Dyersburg would be on if he needed to come back. He was told yes. Then he said the words that would later haunt the people who heard them. He said they had already come that far and would be in Nashville before anyone knew it. The Comanche was refueled, and the 4 occupants boarded again. Hughes requested one more weather update, then took off at 6:07 in the evening. Daylight was fading. The ceiling was low. Nashville was about 90 miles away. There was no further radio contact. About 22 minutes after takeoff, the Comanche had entered the clouds shortly after takeoff, and Hughes lost all visual reference with the ground. Without instrument training, he could not maintain orientation. The aircraft entered what investigators believed was a graveyard spiral, a descending turn in which a pilot, unable to sense the true bank angle, tightens the turn and unknowingly drives the aircraft into the ground. When the plane finally dropped below the overcast, Hughes saw the trees and pulled back with full power. It was too late. The aircraft struck the top of a tall oak tree in a wooded area west of Camden, then hit more trees and slammed into the ground at high speed. The impact destroyed the airplane. All 4 people on board were killed instantly. Searchers later found personal items scattered through the woods, including one of Patsy Cline's shoes and her wristwatch, stopped at 6:20 in the evening, 13 minutes after takeoff. The Civil Aeronautics Board found no evidence of mechanical failure. The engine was producing power at impact. The aircraft had not fallen apart in the air. The cause was clear. A non-instrument rated pilot had attempted visual flight in instrument conditions, became spatially disoriented, and lost control. What makes the story so painful is how avoidable it was. Hughes had been warned. He had stopped at an airport with lights behind him, and a weather briefer telling him not to continue. Nashville was only 90 miles away, less than an hour in good conditions. But good conditions were gone. Patsy Cline wanted to get home to her children. Hughes believed he could make it. Instead, 13 minutes after takeoff, country music lost one of its defining voices in the Tennessee woods. 3 days before he died, Otis Redding sat in a recording studio in Memphis and whistled. It was only a placeholder, a temporary ending for a song he planned to finish later. He never got the chance. That whistle remained on the final recording of Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, and by the time the world heard it, the man who recorded it was at the bottom of a frozen lake in Wisconsin. Redding was 26 years old and rising fast. In just a few years, he had gone from a regional rhythm and blues singer in Georgia to one of the most admired performers in America. Redding was constantly moving from city to city. To avoid long overnight bus rides, he had bought a Beechcraft H-18, a twin-engine airplane originally designed decades earlier. It was sturdy, but old. It lacked modern de-icing systems, and it was not built to carry the kinds of loads Redding often put on it. On December 9, 1967, Redding and his backing band, the Bar-Kays, flew from Nashville to Cleveland for a television appearance and several performances. The Bar-Kays were very young, some still teenagers, and thrilled to be touring with one of the biggest names in soul music. The next day, they planned to continue to Madison, Wisconsin for another show. The group left Cleveland around 12:30 on the afternoon of December 10th. On board were Otis Redding, pilot Richard Fraser, several members of the Barkays, and Redding's young valet, Matthew Kelly. The weather at departure was manageable, but conditions over southern Wisconsin were worse. Rain, drizzle, fog, and near-freezing temperatures were moving into the area. At Madison's Truax Field, the ceiling was extremely low. Pilot Richard Fraser was capable, but the situation was dangerous. The flight would require an instrument approach into bad weather in an aircraft with limited de-icing capability and very little margin for error. As the Beechcraft entered the Madison area, Fraser contacted approach control and was cleared to land. At about 3:25 in the afternoon, the aircraft was only a few miles from the airport and roughly 1,200 feet above Lake Monona. Fraser lowered the landing gear and began the descent. There was no distress call, no obvious sign of panic. To controllers, it looked routine. Then the aircraft dropped. Out of the fog came the Beechcraft, descending far more steeply than a normal approach. Witnesses said the engines sounded uneven, cutting in and out. Seconds later, the aircraft struck the surface of the lake about half a mile from shore and roughly 3 miles short of the runway. The impact shattered the fuselage and scattered wreckage across the icy water. Rescue efforts began almost immediately. Police and local residents rushed toward the crash site. Divers entered the freezing lake and searched through debris. They found one survivor, Ben Cawley, the Barkays trumpet player, had survived by clinging to a seat cushion in the water. He had been asleep shortly before the crash. The last thing he remembered was another band member looking out the window and saying, "Oh no." Cawley could not swim. He survived only because wreckage kept him afloat long enough for rescuers to reach him. He was suffering from severe hypothermia, but he lived. He was the only one. The others were recovered over the next few days. Otis Redding was found still strapped into the co-pilot's seat. Pilot Richard Fraser and the other victims were also found in or near the wreckage. In total, 7 people were killed. The investigation never identified one definitive cause. The official report stated that the exact reason for the crash could not be determined. But investigators pointed to several likely factors. Freezing precipitation may have caused ice to build on the aircraft. The pilot was operating in conditions that left almost no room for error. The Beechcraft had no cockpit voice recorder and no flight data recorder, so whatever happened in the final seconds went into the lake with it. What makes the story especially haunting is how close they were. The airport was only 3 miles away. The aircraft had been cleared to land. The gear was already down. In normal conditions, they were only minutes, possibly less, from the runway. Instead, somewhere between the fog, the freezing moisture, and the final descent over Lake Monona, the airplane stopped flying. Less than a month later, Stax Records released "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay." It became the first posthumous single to reach #1 on both the pop and rhythm and blues charts. The next day, his new single was supposed to come out. It was called "I Got a Name." Jim Croce had spent years writing songs in basements and playing coffee houses for almost nothing. And now, at 30 years old, he was finally breaking through. Croce had performed that evening at Northwestern State University in Natchitoches, Louisiana, on September 20th, 1973. After the show, he and his entourage boarded a chartered Beechcraft E-18S at Natchitoches Regional Airport. With him were guitarist Maury Muehlisen, comedian George Stevens, manager Kenneth Cortese, and road manager Dennis Rast. The pilot was Robert Elliott, 57 years old, a veteran aviator with more than 14,000 flight hours. On paper, Elliott looked like the ideal pilot. What was not visible on paper was his health. He suffered from severe coronary artery disease, a condition that had been worsening for years. Before the flight, he had reportedly run from a motel to the airport. For a man in his late 50s with advanced heart disease, that mattered. The destination was Sherman, Texas, where Croce was scheduled to perform the next night. The flight was expected to take about 45 minutes. The group had originally planned to leave the following morning, but the schedule changed, and they decided to depart that night. It was dark. The sky was hazy, with fog settling over the flat Louisiana terrain. Beyond the runway was farmland and scattered trees, hard to see against a black sky. The Beechcraft taxied out and began its takeoff roll. The aircraft lifted off and started climbing. 590 feet beyond the end of the runway stood a single pecan tree. It was the only significant obstruction in the departure path. The Beechcraft did not climb high enough to clear it. The aircraft struck the tree and crashed into a wooded area near the airport. There was no fire. All 6 people on board were killed instantly. The investigation focused on 2 questions. Why did the aircraft fail to clear a tree so close to the runway? And why did the pilot not see it in time to avoid it? The answers pointed to Robert Elliott. Investigators concluded that the probable cause was the pilot's failure to see and avoid the obstruction after a night takeoff, with physical impairment and reduced visibility from fog and darkness as major factors. His severe coronary artery disease was cited as significant. Some evidence suggested he may even have suffered a cardiac event during the takeoff or initial climb. The NTSB also found problems in pre-flight preparation. Weather planning was inadequate. Weight and balance calculations were either insufficient or not done properly. In an older aircraft like the Beechcraft E-18S, those were serious failures. The album cover showed the band standing in flames. It was meant to look dramatic and rebellious. The album was called Street Survivors. It was released on October 17, 1977. 3 days later, Lynyrd Skynyrd's chartered airplane ran out of fuel over Mississippi, and MCA Records pulled the cover from stores. The image had become too disturbing to ignore. Lynyrd Skynyrd had spent a decade becoming one of the biggest Southern rock bands in America. Sweet Home Alabama was an anthem. Freebird had become the kind of song that could turn an arena electric. By October 1977, the band was in the middle of a major tour promoting Street Survivors. Guitarist Steve Gaines had recently joined and was being seen as a major new force in the band. His sister Cassie was also on tour as one of the backing singers. They were traveling in a chartered Convair CV-240, a twin-engine propeller aircraft built in 1948. It was old, worn, and by many accounts unreliable. The band had already agreed this would be the last tour using it. A Learjet was waiting for them in Baton Rouge. After the October 20th show, they were supposed to upgrade. They never got there. The Convair had already shown signs of trouble. 2 days earlier, on a flight from Lakeland, Florida to Greenville, South Carolina, several people on board saw flames shooting from the right engine. Band members reported it to the pilots, Captain Walter McCreary and First Officer William Gray. They were told it was a magneto problem, something the crew considered manageable and planned to deal with later. Cassie Gaines was frightened enough by the earlier engine problems that she reportedly did not want to board the plane. She had even considered traveling by truck instead. The Convair departed Greenville at 5:02 in the afternoon on October 20th with 26 people on board. The aircraft had been refueled, and investigators later estimated that it had about 502 gallons of fuel available. Under normal conditions, the numbers were already tight, but conditions were not normal. Because of the magneto problem, the right engine was running too rich, burning significantly more fuel than expected. That meant the aircraft needed more fuel than it had. The difference was about 81 gallons. Neither pilot appears to have caught it in time. For the first 2 hours, the flight was uneventful. About 1 hour and 50 minutes into the flight, the right engine sputtered and failed. The left engine followed soon after. The cabin went quiet. Drummer Artemis Pyle later recalled going forward and seeing the captain's face drained of color. The crew told everyone to brace. The pilots radioed that they were low on fuel and requested vectors to Macomb, Mississippi, the nearest suitable airport. Macomb was only about 10 miles away. They were not going to make it. Without power, the Convair descended over dense forest. There were no clear fields ahead, only pine trees and swamp. At approximately 6:52 in the evening, the airplane clipped the tops of trees, then struck a larger one and broke apart in the woods. Captain McCreary, First Officer Gray, Ronnie Van Zant, Steve Gaines, Cassie Gaines, and Assistant Road Manager Dean Kilpatrick were killed. 20 people survived, but all of them were badly injured. Pyle, despite broken ribs, crawled out of the wreckage and made his way through the swamp with 2 others until they reached help. Rescue was difficult. Survivors had to be carried out through rough terrain and taken away in improvised vehicles. The NTSB concluded that the probable cause was fuel exhaustion and total loss of power in both engines due to the crew's failure to properly monitor the fuel supply. Contributing factors included poor flight planning and the engine problem that increased fuel burn. In simple terms, the aircraft ran out of fuel. That is what makes the story so brutal. Baton Rouge was close. The new jet was waiting. The band was on top of the world, and the distance between a normal landing and a deadly crash came down to fuel that was being burned faster than expected, while nobody in the cockpit was keeping up with the numbers. Ronnie Van Zant was 29. Steve Gaines was 28. Cassie Gaines was 29. Street Survivors went gold just 10 days after the crash. The band would later return in a different form, and the songs would live on. The night before he died, Stevie Ray Vaughan told his crew about a dream. In it, he was at his own funeral. Thousands of people were there, inside the chapel and out on the lawn. He could see their faces and feel their grief. He said the dream was terrifying, but strangely peaceful. The next day, it came true. Stevie Ray Vaughan had spent the 1980s doing 2 things at once, nearly destroying himself and helping revive the blues for a new generation. He had left school young, built his reputation in Texas clubs, and become one of the most intense guitarists in American music. His playing combined the force of rock with the feel of electric blues, and by the late 1980s, he was widely seen as one of the greatest guitarists alive. He had also nearly lost everything to alcohol and cocaine. By the middle of the decade, his addictions were so severe that he collapsed on stage in London. He entered rehabilitation in 1986, got sober, and stayed sober. By 1990, he was playing at the highest level of his life, recording with his brother Jimmy Vaughan, and touring with Eric Clapton. On August 26, 1990, Vaughan played the second of two nights at Alpine Valley Music Theater in Wisconsin, about 30 miles southwest of Milwaukee. It was a remarkable lineup. Eric Clapton headlined, and the shows also featured Robert Cray, Buddy Guy, and Jimmy Vaughan. By the end of the night, all of them were on stage together for an encore jam that people there would remember for years. After the show, 4 Bell Jet Ranger helicopters were waiting on a nearby golf course to take the musicians and crew to Chicago. That was standard practice at Alpine Valley. The venue sat at the end of a road that became hopelessly jammed after concerts, so flying out was the fastest way to leave. Stevie Ray Vaughan, his brother Jimmy, and Jimmy's wife Connie had seats reserved on the third helicopter. But when they arrived, they found that 3 members of Clapton's touring crew had taken those seats. Only one place remained. Stevie told his brother that he really wanted to get back to Chicago to be with his fiancée, Jana Lapidus. Jimmy and Connie stepped aside and gave him the last seat. They would take another helicopter later. That small decision determined everything. The pilot of the third helicopter was Jeff Brown, an experienced commercial pilot with thousands of flight hours. But there was a critical detail. He was not instrument rated on helicopters, and the Bell Jet Ranger itself was not certified for instrument flight. It was meant to be flown in visual conditions. The conditions that night were not truly visual. It was dark. Fog clung to the hills and low ground around the ski resort. Condensation was so heavy that pilots had to keep wiping their windshields before departure. Visibility changed from usable to almost nothing depending on location and altitude. The terrain around the golf course was uneven, with ski slopes rising above the departure area. The 4 helicopters lifted off around 12:40 in the morning on August 27th, leaving at short intervals. The first 2 climbed steeply and headed toward Chicago without trouble. Their pilots later said the conditions were poor, but still manageable if they kept proper visual references. The third helicopter did something different. After takeoff, instead of climbing the way the others had, Brown stayed lower. He banked to the southeast. Within a few hundred yards, the helicopter disappeared into the fog. About 6/10 of a mile from the golf course, it struck the side of a ski slope. The crash site was well above the level of the departure point, but still below the top of the hill. The impact destroyed the helicopter instantly. All 5 people on board were killed at once. No one realized right away that the helicopter was missing. The other flights reached Chicago. When the third one never arrived, calls began to go out. Hours later, searchers found the wreckage near the top of the hill. Eric Clapton and Jimmy Vaughan were later called to identify the bodies. Stevie Ray Vaughan had suffered catastrophic injuries. Toxicology found no drugs and no alcohol in his system. He had been fully sober. All 5 victims had been wearing seatbelts. Investigators found no mechanical failure. The helicopter had been functioning normally. The NTSB concluded that the crash was caused by poor planning and poor decision-making by the pilot, who failed to gain enough altitude before flying over rising ground at night. Fog, darkness, haze, terrain, and the lack of outside visual references all contributed. In simple terms, he flew into a hill he could not see. What makes the story so painful is how much of it came down to chance. Stevie Ray Vaughan was not originally supposed to be on that helicopter. His reserved seats had been taken. He asked his brother to step aside so he could get back to Chicago sooner. Jimmy said yes. If that one conversation had gone differently, Stevie likely would have been on another helicopter, flown by a pilot who chose another heading and climbed higher. He probably would have landed safely in Chicago. She was 22 years old, had already released 3 platinum albums, starred in major films, and become one of the defining voices of late 1990s R&B, Aaliyah was not at the end of her career. She was only beginning something bigger. Aaliyah Dana Houghton did not need to be on that airplane. She was supposed to leave the Bahamas the next day, but the video shoot for Rock the Boat wrapped early, and everyone wanted to get back to the United States immediately. That decision cost 9 people their lives. Aaliyah and her team had traveled to the Abaco Islands to film the video around Marsh Harbor. The group had arrived on a larger aircraft, one with enough capacity for both the passengers and the equipment. But for the return trip, a smaller airplane was used instead, a Cessna 402B operated by Black Hawk International Airways. That aircraft could legally carry 7 passengers and 1 pilot. 9 people boarded it. That was the first problem. The second was the cargo. The team loaded cameras, lighting gear, wardrobe, luggage, and other production equipment from the video shoot into the aircraft. What had fit on the larger airplane did not fit safely on this one. Baggage handlers later told investigators that the aircraft looked too heavy. The pilot also warned that the load was beyond what was safe, but the passengers were tired, impatient, and eager to leave. Everything was loaded anyway. The pilot was Luis Antonio Morales III, 30 years old. He had started working for Black Hawk only 2 days earlier. He was not the pilot authorized to fly that specific aircraft under the company's operating approval. Investigators later found that his FAA credentials had been obtained using falsified flight hour records. In simple terms, his paperwork made him look far more experienced than he really was. The airplane's maximum takeoff weight was 6,300 pounds. Investigators determined that it was loaded to about 7,000 pounds, roughly 700 pounds over the limit. That alone was dangerous. But the weight distribution made the situation even worse. Heavy passengers were seated toward the rear, pushing the center of gravity beyond the safe aft limit. In that condition, the airplane would naturally want to raise its nose during takeoff. At low speed and low altitude, that can become almost impossible to control. At about 6:45 in the evening on August 25, 2001, Morales started the engines at Marsh Harbor Airport. Witnesses later said he had some difficulty getting them running. Eventually, the aircraft taxied to runway 27 and began its takeoff roll. The weather was good. The runway was long enough. There was no storm, no fog, no hidden mechanical trap waiting in the sky. This was not a crash caused by nature. It was caused by decisions made before the aircraft ever left the ground. The Cessna used an unusually long stretch of runway before lifting off, far more than normal for a properly loaded aircraft of that type. When it finally became airborne, it climbed in a steep, nose-high attitude and reached only about 40 feet. Then the left wing dropped, the nose pitched down, the airplane rolled to the left, lost what little altitude it had gained, and crashed into marshy ground just beyond the runway. The impact destroyed the aircraft. A fire broke out in the wreckage. All 9 people on board were killed. Aaliyah was found still strapped to her seat. The investigation later determined that she died from impact trauma and burns. Several passengers were thrown from the aircraft during the crash, showing just how violent the impact had been. The wreckage field was compact, a sign that the airplane had come down almost immediately after takeoff with almost no time to recover. Investigators examined both engines and found no evidence of mechanical failure. They had been functioning normally. The airframe was intact until impact. The cause was not mysterious. The airplane was simply too heavy and too far out of balance to fly safely. Morales' autopsy made the story even worse. It found evidence of recent cocaine use and alcohol. So the full picture became almost unbelievable. A pilot with fraudulent experience, recent drug use, and no proper authorization had attempted to fly an overloaded aircraft with too many passengers and too much cargo. The broader investigation exposed serious failures inside Black Hawk International Airways. The company had regulatory problems, had substituted a smaller airplane for the return trip, and had failed to properly adjust the passenger and cargo load. This was not one mistake. It was a chain of them. Aaliyah was 22 years old. Rock the Boat, the video she had just finished filming, was later released after her death and became one of the lasting images of her career. In it, she moves across a bright Caribbean shore, calm and weightless, only hours before boarding an airplane that should never have left the ground. What makes the crash so brutal is how little sky the airplane was given. The flight to Florida should have taken less than an hour. The weather was clear. The engines were working. The runway was long enough. Nothing outside the aircraft was truly stopping them. Everything that killed the people on board had been loaded onto that airplane by human hands. Too many bodies, too much cargo, too little experience, a center of gravity pushed too far back, and a pilot who should never have been in command. The airplane flew only for a few seconds, about 40 feet high. Then it rolled, dropped, and was gone. What ties these stories together is not fame. It is exposure. These people were famous, admired, celebrated, and in some cases at the absolute peak of their careers. But once the cabin door closed and the engine started, they were no different from anyone else placed in the hands of weather, maintenance, fuel calculations, pilot judgment, and time pressure. A hit record could not change a center of gravity. A sold-out tour could not clear fog from a windshield. A platinum album could not make an overloaded airplane climb. That is what makes these accidents so unsettling. Most of them did not begin with chaos. They began with something that felt manageable: a short flight after a concert, a charter to avoid a long drive, a weather delay that someone thought they could work around, a mechanical problem that looked small enough to defer, a pilot who seemed experienced enough, a departure that only needed a few minutes of luck. And for a while, that logic held. That is the dangerous part. These flights did not always look doomed at the start. They looked possible, reasonable, temporary. A simple decision to leave now instead of later, to keep going instead of stopping, to trust the airplane one more time, to believe that one short leg, one final climb, one last approach would be enough. But aviation is often cruel in exactly that space. Not in the obvious moment when everybody knows something is wrong, but earlier, when the warning signs are still small enough to ignore. A little too much weight, a little too much confidence, a little too much pressure to stay on schedule, a little too much trust in a machine, a pilot, or a plan that should have been questioned. And once those things combine, fame becomes irrelevant. That may be the hardest thing to sit with in stories like these. These were not distant legends in some abstract history. These were real people in very human moments. They were tired after shows. They wanted to get home. They wanted to sleep in a real bed, see someone they loved, make the next date, keep the tour moving, keep the career moving. Those impulses are ordinary. That is why these stories still hit so hard. They are not built only on celebrity. They are built on choices that feel recognizable, right up until the moment they become irreversible. And maybe that is the final lesson in all of this. The aircraft does not care who is on board. Not if the fuel is wrong. Not if the weather is closing in. Not if the load is too heavy. Not if the pilot is tired, impaired, underqualified, or simply unwilling to say no. The laws that keep an airplane flying are completely indifferent to talent, success, youth, or legacy. What remains, decades later, is the contrast. The music survived. The voices survived. The recordings survived. In some cases, the songs became even bigger after death, but the people themselves were lost in moments that should have been routine, on flights that should have been short, in aircraft that should never have been in the air under those conditions. That is why these stories still matter. Not because tragedy followed famous names, but because each one shows how quickly a normal departure can become final when small failures are allowed to pile up unchecked. If you want more aviation and true disaster stories told with care and detail, subscribe to Terra Obscura.